I open up with a conversation about someone who used to be a comedian on everybody's lips, Dave Chappelle. We've kind of stopped talking about him because he's no longer on Comedy Central. But I want to argue Dave Chappelle had a moment, what people called, maybe a moment when he had a breakdown, a moment when he went crazy. Different media folks ran with it in different ways. But he had a moment, I argue, at the end of the run of his television program, when he exemplified some of what I think is the subtlety, but also the power of what I'm calling racial paranoia, what makes it different from racism. So for those who don't know, and I kind of unpacked this a little bit at the beginning of the book, Dave Chappelle was in charge of his own television program on Comedy Central, and it was tremendously successful in any way you might be able to judge that. Critically, he was a darling of the media, right? On the left and the right, actually, when you go back and look at some of that history. But he was also making a ton of money for Comedy Central and for himself. And so the idea was there was one point at which he had signed a contract for X number of more years, $50 million supposedly he was going to earn for it, and walked out. Actually walked off the set, went to an airport, and went to Africa, right? So already folks said, okay, red flag. What's going on with this guy? Walking away from all this money, and then he's going to end up in Africa. He admitted afterwards he didn't even tell his wife or his kids ahead of time. He just bounced, right? Now, when he tries to unpack why he did that, when he tries to explain exactly what happened in that moment, I want to argue he's demonstrating the exact specificity of what I'm calling racial paranoia and why it's different from racism of old. So what happened? I don't know how many folks know the story, but Dave Chappelle is doing one of his controversial skits. He's one of these people who doesn't play in an egg-shelly kind of way with questions about race. He is adamant about it. He is clear about it. He likes playing with the racial fire, as people say. And his comedy is saturated with discussions of race. Some people might say oversaturated. But that's his project. That's his job. He would argue his job is to get America to think differently and critically about race, and he's going to use comedy to do it. Fine, you might agree, you might not agree. But that's what he imagined his project to be. And under those auspices, he decided to do a skit, pushing the envelope ever further, in blackface. And he was going to play a pixie in blackface, and a pixie who emerged almost out of thin air whenever any racial group's worst racial stereotypes were on display, right? So, so in the opening skit, he's playing himself in first class in an airplane, and he's trying to decide whether he's going to have fish or chicken for his meal. Relatively innocuous decision, right? But of course, what he starts to think about are all the stereotypes around African Americans loving which of those two things? Chicken, right? So immediately the pixie jumps in, right? So this is him in blackface, short, on his shoulder, shucking and jiving, tap dancing, singing the blues, talking about, oh, you better get the chicken, right? You're gonna have to get the chicken, right? You're gonna, ooh. And for him, in that moment, is about playing with all of these ideas about what stereotypes mean for people's everyday lives. And he says while he was performing the pixie part of this skit, he looked over and he saw one of his crew members, a white crew member, relatively low down on the food chain, who was doing what everyone was supposed to do. He was laughing at this skit, at him in blackface, this pixie character, shucking and jiving. But Dave Chappelle says there was something about the way this person was laughing that for the first time ever made him uncomfortable with his own humor. And he said he couldn't describe it, he couldn't articulate it, but he really just felt profoundly disturbed by the nature of that laugh. Probably something that might be the opposite of what Du Bois once called the delicious chuckle of African Americans, right? Something not like that. And what he said was, in that moment, he realized, one, he couldn't control how this comedy was going to get redeployed, but then he also couldn't quite articulate to people what made him feel so uncomfortable, right? So now, what didn't this person do, right? This person who worked for his show. He didn't say, well, all African Americans, in his opinion, are just like that blackface pixie. He didn't say, black folks love chicken, of course you love chicken. He didn't call him the N-word, anything like that. He simply laughed at the joke, right? But in that moment, that laughing at the joke, part of what's happening there, I argue in the book, is the demonstration of just how much we've repressed conversations of race such that we don't even have a language to even talk across racial lines. And so when someone like Chappelle sees this laugh, part of what he's recognizing is an American context where racism can no longer strut its stuff in the public sphere the way it once did, right? Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon in American life and culture, right? For most of the history of this republic, racism could express itself unabashedly in public, right? I mean, you know, politicians, entertainers, no one really had to bite their tongue around race, right? And again, remember, race itself is an accusation. So now we're often in these debates about whether we can accuse someone of racism. Are they being racist? Is accusing someone of racism a form of racism? You know, the initial accusation was the construct of race, I argue in the book. That is to say, race was concocted with the assumption that, a very straightforward assumption, right? An accusation that you are inferior as a function of your racial identity. That was the accusation. There's a boatload of science, historiography, art propped up to justify that claim. But race itself was started as an accusation, right? And one thing that we're seeing now is it's an accusation no one any longer wants to claim. On the political left or the political right, I would argue, right? So if we've canonized the 1960s version of racism with, someone, a political figure standing at the front door of a public school saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. We've moved into a moment, most people would say thankfully, where very few people, no elected officials, would dare to make a pronouncement like that in the present. By most vectors we might imagine, by most valuations we might have, that's a positive thing, right? I mean, I would argue it's a wonderful thing that in some ways we've cleaned up the public discourse of explicit forms of racial animus and distrust and hatred. That's a positive. But I argue that there's a flip side to that. And the flip side to that is we've also done a good job at becoming a version of what now we're all bandying about as post-racial. But I say it's a particular kind of it's not having transcended race, which is how people invoke it when they talk about Barack Obama potentially being president. We've so repressed actual conversations about race that it's as though it no longer exists, right? We've pushed it so far beneath the surface of discourse that we actually can't see it anymore, not productively, not proactively, right? So part of my point is to say, if we think about Dave Chappelle's moment of seeing that laugh as him simply being hypersensitive, him being a crackpot, him not understanding or being unfair to someone who worked for him, and not recognize the fact that he's trying to negotiate an unprecedented racial landscape, something no one has ever had to really think about before this generation, right? A racism that will never honestly, accurately speak its name in interracial, multiracial contexts. Now, the other component of this is the fact that there is an assumption going on that people are talking about race in the old school forms that we remember, right? I did 10 years of research in urban communities mostly in the Northeast in New York City. And time again, the folks I would work with, my informants, would tell me, well, they couldn't wait till they got enough money or they retired so they could go back down to the South. And when you tried to get them to unpack what it was about the South that was a lure to them, invariably what they would say was, and some of this was tongue-in-cheek, but not exclusively, they'd say, well, you know what? In the South, at least with white Southern racists, what you see is what you get, right? And what was that? Well, the argument was race is still operative. Racism is still there, but no one's going to own it. And how do you negotiate a world where there must be racial wolves out there lurking, but no one claims to be a racial wolf? And there's no discourse about race that's explicit and adamant about positions like those tried and true 1960s positions that some of our stereotype versions of white supremacists exemplified for us in our PBS documentaries of yore. So if that form of racism is gone, if Archie Bunker is dead, right? And we saw that coming, right? Even Archie couldn't perform his sort of racial ideologies out in the public sphere. It was always at home, right? And part of my point is our homes are all like Archie Bunker's homes, even now today in the 21st century. And by that, what do I mean? I mean, we all live most of us live in decidedly racially segregated, intimate social communities, right? Our family communities, our family networks, our friendship networks, at their most intimate levels, are decidedly segregated. And so part of what that means is we can imagine scenarios where there are groups of people that we imagine to be part of another racial community who are having conversations amongst themselves because they're existing all by themselves without any interlopers. And that's where the argument goes, the honest conversations come in, right? And that they change their discourse when they're talking in these mixed racial communities.